The sky over Bougainville was clear that morning in April 1943. A Japanese transport plane carved a slow arc above the jungle canopy, its olive paint catching the sun. Inside sat a 59-year-old admiral in a freshly pressed white uniform, his gloved hands folded across his lap. He was the most powerful naval commander in the Empire of Japan. He was the man who had planned Pearl Harbor. And somewhere below him, climbing fast through the tropical haze, 16 American P-38 Lightnings were hunting him by name. They were young men. Most of them were younger than the Admiral's own son. They had eaten powdered eggs for breakfast on a muddy airstrip at Guadalcanal. They had been briefed in a tent with a single bare bulb. They had been told that the man in that transport plane was the reason their older brothers had died at Pearl Harbor, and that today they were going to settle it. They would find him within minutes, but that is not where this story begins. To understand why Isoroku Yamamoto died over a Pacific jungle, you must go back. Not to Pearl Harbor, not to Midway, you must go back further. To a young Japanese officer riding alone on an American train in 1919, watching mile after mile of steel mills and oil derricks and assembly lines roll past his window. Because long before America hunted him, Yamamoto had warned his own country about the America he had seen with his own eyes. He had warned them about the factories. He had warned them about the oil. He had warned them about the time. He had told them they had 6 months, maybe a year, and no one wanted to listen. Isoroku Yamamoto was born on the 4th of April 1884 in the snow-shadowed village of Kushigun-Sonshimura near the old castle town of Nagaoka in Niigata Prefecture. He was the 6th son of a low-ranking samurai named Takano Sadayoshi. The name his father gave him meant simply 56. It was the age his father had reached when the boy was born. He grew up in a country still drunk on its recent triumphs. The Meiji Restoration had transformed Japan from a closed feudal society into a rising industrial power in a single generation. Boys like Isoroku were taught that discipline, sacrifice, and naval power were the path to greatness. At 16, he passed the brutal entrance examination for the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima on the shore of Hiroshima Bay. He spent 3 years at Etajima in study and rigorous physical training. He graduated in 1904, just in time for war. In May of 1905, a young ensign named Isoroku Takano stood on the deck of the cruiser Nishin as it steamed into battle against the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Strait of Tsushima. The engagement would become legendary. Admiral Togo Heihachiro's annihilation of an entire Russian armada, the moment Japan declared itself a true naval power. But for the young ensign, Tsushima was something more intimate. A Russian shell exploded near him. When the smoke cleared, 2 fingers of his left hand were gone. Years later, the geisha of Tokyo's pleasure quarters would nickname him 80 sen, because a full manicure cost 100 sen, and he was missing 2 of the 10 fingers. He laughed when they called him that. He always laughed at the small things. The big things he carried in silence. After the war, the young officer was adopted into the Yamamoto family, a more prestigious samurai lineage. He took their name. He kept his rank, his ambition, and a slow-growing hunger to see what lay beyond the islands of his birth. That hunger would carry him to America. In 1919, at the age of 35, Lieutenant Commander Isoroku Yamamoto stepped off a steamship in San Francisco Bay. He had been selected to study at Harvard University. What he saw in the next 2 years would shape every strategic instinct he would ever have. He took trains across the continent. He rode through the steel valleys of Pennsylvania, where blast furnaces lit the sky red at night. He stood at the edge of the oil fields of Texas, where wooden derricks stretched to the horizon like a forest of black skeletons pumping wealth from the earth. He visited Detroit, where the moving assembly line at the Ford Motor Company was producing automobiles at a rate no nation on earth could match. He did not see what most foreign visitors saw. He did not see the music halls, the skyscrapers, the bright department stores, the careless wealth of the roaring 20s. He saw the underneath. He saw a country that could, if it chose, build anything, in any quantity, at any speed. He returned to Japan in 1921 carrying a quiet certainty he could never quite share with his fellow officers. Most of them had never left the home islands. Most of them imagined America the way the Japanese press imagined America: soft, hedonistic, divided, distracted, a society of jazz and cocktails that would crumble at the first serious blow. Yamamoto knew better. In 1924, at the age of 40, he made a decision that would mark him as different. He switched his specialty from gunnery, the prestige track of the Imperial Navy, to naval aviation. Battleships were the past, he believed. Aircraft carriers were the future. 2 years later, in 1926, he was sent back to America, this time as a senior naval attaché in Washington, D.C., with the rank of captain. For 2 more years he watched, he listened, he measured. He came home a man who understood something his country refused to understand. Japan saw America's comfort. Yamamoto saw America's capacity. In December of 1936, he was appointed Vice Minister of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was now one of the most senior naval officers in the country, with a seat at the highest levels of imperial policy. And almost immediately, he made enemies. Yamamoto opposed the rising tide of militarism in Tokyo. He opposed the alliance the army wanted with Nazi Germany. He opposed the war in China spiraling out of control. He opposed, above all, the growing fantasy that Japan could one day fight the United States and win. These were not safe opinions to hold. Right-wing extremists, army-aligned ultra-nationalists, and members of secret societies began circulating his name on death lists. Rumors of a bounty on his head reached 100,000 yen, a fortune at the time. Tanks were positioned outside the Navy Ministry. Machine guns were installed at the entrances. The Vice Minister of the Navy moved through Tokyo under armed guard, knowing that a young fanatic with a pistol could end his career and his life in any quiet street. By the summer of 1939, the political situation had become so dangerous that the Prime Minister himself decided Yamamoto could no longer remain in the capital safely. On the 30th of August 1939, 2 days before Adolf Hitler's panzers crossed into Poland and ignited the war in Europe, Yamamoto was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet. It was a promotion. It was also exile. He was sent to sea, partly to put salt water between him and the men who wanted him dead. Think about that for a moment. The man who would, just over 2 years later, plan the largest surprise attack in modern history. The man who would send hundreds of aircraft screaming down on Pearl Harbor was, at this very moment, being protected from assassination by his own countrymen. Not because he was too aggressive, because he was not aggressive enough. The architect of the attack on America was, in 1939, the most prominent voice in Japan warning against a war with America. That contradiction would never resolve. It would only deepen. By the autumn of 1940, the world was on fire. France had fallen. Britain was alone. Hitler ruled Europe, from the Atlantic coast to the Polish frontier. And in Tokyo, the militarists saw an opportunity that seemed too perfect to refuse. The European colonial empires in Asia, the Dutch East Indies with its vast oil reserves, French Indochina with its rubber and rice, British Malaya with its tin and rubber, the Philippines under American protection. All of them suddenly looked vulnerable. Japan, the militarists argued, could seize these territories and finally secure the resources it needed to become a true world power. On the 27th of September 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The three Axis powers were now bound by treaty. The road to war with the Western democracies, including the United States, had become a one-way street. It was in this atmosphere that Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe summoned Admiral Yamamoto for a private conversation. Konoe was 48 years old, an aristocrat descended from the ancient Fujiwara line, the bloodline that had once supplied empresses to the imperial court 1,000 years before. He was elegant, cultured, indecisive, and increasingly trapped by forces he could not control. The army wanted war, the navy was divided, the emperor was silent. And the prime minister, who privately believed Japan was sleepwalking toward catastrophe, needed someone to tell him the truth. So he asked the man who had lived in America, the man who had stood inside the Detroit factories, the man who had watched the Texas oil fields pump from horizon to horizon. What would happen, he asked, if Japan fought the United States? Yamamoto's answer would be repeated, paraphrased, and translated for decades afterward. The phrasing varied in different sources. The meaning never did. "If I am told to fight," he said, "I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months. But after that, I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years. And then, more quietly, I hope you will make every effort to avoid war with America." The Prime Minister listened. The Prime Minister did not act. 6 months, maybe a year. That was the window Yamamoto believed Japan had. That was the time he calculated in the silence of his sea cabin before the sleeping industrial giant on the other side of the Pacific would wake up, dress for war, and begin building ships, planes, and rage at a scale Japan could not match. He was not predicting victory in 6 months. He was not predicting defeat in 6 months. He was warning his country that there was a brief, narrow corridor of time in which Japan might dominate the Pacific, and that beyond that corridor lay a darkness he could not see his way through. He knew what those trains, those factories, those oil fields could produce when an angry democracy decided to pour itself into a war. And he knew something else, something the militarists in Tokyo were too proud to admit. A surprise attack on the United States would not break American morale. A surprise attack would not force America to the negotiating table. A surprise attack would not produce a quick peace. A surprise attack would do exactly the opposite. The danger was not that Japan could hurt America. The danger was that hurting America might be the one thing that united it. Through the spring and summer of 1941, the situation deteriorated. Japan invaded southern French Indochina in July. In response, on the 26th of that month, President Franklin Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Netherlands followed within days, and then came the cut that would change everything, the oil embargo. Japan imported roughly 80% of its oil from the United States. That oil was now gone. The Imperial Navy estimated it had perhaps 18 months of fuel reserves before its battleships would sit motionless in their harbors and its aircraft would be grounded. The clock was no longer just running, it was screaming. On the 18th of October, 1941, Prime Minister Kono resigned, broken by the impossible pressures of a government that wanted peace and of military that demanded war. He was replaced by General Hideki Tojo, 57 years old, a hardline army man, a believer in confrontation, a man who would lead Japan to the precipice and over it. Yamamoto, by this point, had stopped arguing. The decision had been taken away from the men who understood the cost. It now lay in the hands of men who understood only the calendar. He had warned them. He had told the Prime Minister. He had told the Cabinet. He had told anyone who would listen. They had nodded. They had thanked him for his service. They had then ignored him completely so. Yamamoto, the man who had seen America from the inside, the man who had stood in the shadow of its factories and felt the weight of its capacity. Yamamoto did the only thing a Japanese admiral of his generation could do. He obeyed. He sat at his desk aboard the battleship Nagato in the autumn of 1941, and he began to plan. If Japan had to fight America, he reasoned, then Japan must not fight the war the militarists imagined. Japan must not fight a long, methodical war of attrition. Japan would lose that war. He had told them so. Japan had to fight a different war, a war of shock, a war of speed, a war designed to slam shut the gates of the Pacific before the American giant could climb out of bed. If the United States Pacific Fleet could be destroyed in a single morning, if its battleships could be sunk at their moorings, if its airfields could be cratered, if its carriers could be caught in port, then Japan might buy itself the time it needed. Time to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Time to build a defensive perimeter across the Central Pacific. Time, perhaps, to convince Washington that the cost of fighting back would be too high, that a negotiated peace on Japanese terms would be the cheaper, wiser path. It was not a strategy of victory. It was a strategy of buying time, 6 months, maybe a year. That was all he was asking for. That was all he believed Japan could possibly use. In the long lamplit hours of his sea cabin, the Admiral worked. He studied charts of the Hawaiian Islands. He calculated launch positions, fuel ranges, aircraft loadings. He selected the man who would lead the first wave, a young air commander named Mitsuo Fuchida. He picked the ships, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuik. He picked the route, a northern approach across the empty, storm-lashed reaches of the North Pacific, where no commercial shipping would spot the strike force. He worked through the equations of surprise. He memorized the layout of Battleship Row. He calculated the angle of attack for the modified torpedoes that would have to run in shallow harbor water. And every night, as he worked, the same warning whispered behind every calculation. The window was narrow. The window was closing. After it closed, he had no expectation of success. He was the man who understood America better than almost any officer in the Imperial Navy. He was also the man preparing to launch the attack that would wake America up. In Tokyo, the war planners assumed the first blow would frighten the Americans into negotiation. They assumed the first blow would prove Japanese superiority. They assumed the first blow would buy not months but decades. Yamamoto assumed something else entirely. He assumed the first blow would enrage the Americans beyond anything Tokyo could imagine. He assumed the first blow would unite a country that had been bitterly divided about the war in Europe just days before. He assumed the first blow would set a clock ticking, a clock he could not stop, a clock he could not slow, a clock that would count down to the moment when America's full industrial weight came crashing across the Pacific. He assumed that the moment Japanese bombs began falling on Pearl Harbor, his own country would have entered a war it could not win. And he assumed all of this, and then he gave the order anyway, because that was the kind of officer he was, because that was the kind of empire he served. Because in the autumn of 1941, the choice had already been made by men who did not know what he knew. The fleet sailed in late November. 23 vessels of the First Air Fleet steamed eastward into the freezing waters of the North Pacific, maintaining strict radio silence, burning oil that Japan would never get back. The man who had once ridden American trains across the heartland of his future enemy now stood on the bridge of a Japanese battleship, watching his country sail toward the gamble of its life. He had warned them. He had told them the window was 6 months, maybe a year. Now the window was about to open, and on the other side of it, 8,000 miles away, the sleeping giant lay in its bed, unaware that within days, in the gray dawn over Hawaii, it was going to be shaken violently awake by the very man who had spent a decade begging Tokyo not to do it. The dawn came up cold and gray over the North Pacific on the 7th of December, 1941. 250 miles north of the island of Oahu, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers turned into the wind. The flight decks were slick with sea spray. Mechanics in white headbands made final checks on engines. Pilots in leather helmets sat in cockpits, breathing hard, waiting for the flag to drop. In the lead torpedo bomber sat a 39-year-old commander named Mitsuo Fuchida. He had a red shirt under his flight suit, so his men would not see if he was wounded. He had a hachimaki, a samurai headband, tied tight across his brow. He had been chosen by Admiral Yamamoto personally for this moment. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Hawaiian time, the first wave launched. 183 aircraft roared off the carrier decks and climbed into the rising sun. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, horizontal bombers, 0 fighters as escorts. The greatest concentration of naval air power ever assembled in human history was now flying in human base where, at that very moment, sailors were eating breakfast, chaplains were preparing for Sunday services, and the duty watch was watching the sky for nothing in particular. At 7:33 in the morning, Fuchida's radio operator slid back the canopy of his Nakajima bomber and tapped out a coded signal in Morse. 3 letters, too. Ra Tora. It was a Japanese word that meant tiger. It was also the prearranged signal that complete surprise had been achieved. In the carriers, far behind them, the staff officers heard the signal come through the radio room. They looked at each other. Some smiled, some bowed their heads. Admiral Yamamoto on the battleship Nagato, far away in Japanese home waters, received the signal in silence. The gamble had begun. What followed has been described 1,000 times in 1,000 books. The bombs falling on Battleship Row, the Arizona exploding in a column of black smoke that rose 1,000 feet into the air, the Oklahoma rolling over with hundreds of men trapped inside her hull, sailors in their underwear running across decks slick with oil and blood, the chaplain on the West Virginia who, according to legend, manned an anti-aircraft gun himself. By the end of the morning, 18 American warships had been sunk or disabled. 200 American aircraft were destroyed on the ground. 2,403 Americans were dead. Another 1,200 were wounded. The first wave of 183 aircraft had been followed by a second wave of 171. 354 Japanese planes had crossed the sky over Pearl Harbor that morning. Japan had lost 29 of them. By any measure, the attack had been a stunning tactical success. Yamamoto had achieved everything he had set out to achieve. The American Pacific Fleet, the great obstacle to Japanese expansion in the south, lay in ruins. The path to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies was open. The dream of the militarists in Tokyo had become reality in a single morning. And yet, even on the morning of December 8th, as the first reports came in and the cheers rolled through the Imperial Navy headquarters, the cracks were already visible to the man who had designed the attack. He saw them immediately. He alone did not celebrate. The first crack was the carriers. 3 American aircraft carriers were assigned to the Pacific Fleet: the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga. Yamamoto's entire plan had been built around catching these ships in port and destroying them. Without their carriers, the Americans would be unable to project naval air power across the Pacific for many months. The window of opportunity Yamamoto needed would open wide, but the carriers were not there. The Enterprise was at sea, ferrying aircraft to Wake Island. The Lexington was at sea, ferrying aircraft to Midway. The Saratoga was on the west coast, completing maintenance. The harbor that morning had held battleships. It had not held what would, within months, become the only ships that mattered. The second crack was the infrastructure. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, 54 years old, commander of the strike force out at sea, had been authorized by Yamamoto to launch a third wave if conditions allowed. The third wave was meant to destroy the fuel storage tanks above Pearl Harbor, millions of gallons of oil sitting in unprotected steel cylinders. It was meant to destroy the dry docks, the repair facilities, the submarine pens. Nagumo decided against it. The element of surprise was gone. American defenses were waking up. The location of the American carriers was unknown. The risk to his own carriers seemed, in his judgment, too great. He turned the fleet north and ran for home. The fuel stayed in the tanks. The dry docks survived intact. The repair facilities, which would soon resurrect damaged American ships at impossible speeds, were untouched. It would prove, in the long arithmetic of the Pacific War, one of the most consequential decisions ever made by a Japanese naval officer. The third crack was diplomatic. The Japanese government had planned to deliver a formal declaration of war to the State Department in Washington 30 minutes before the attack began. The intent was to make Pearl Harbor a legitimate act of war, however shocking, rather than a sneak attack. The declaration was not delivered in time. The Japanese embassy in Washington fumbled the decryption and the typing of the long, complicated document. By the time the Japanese ambassador handed it to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, the bombs had already been falling for over an hour. Hull, who knew this, took the document, read it briefly, and addressed the ambassador with what was perhaps the coldest sentence ever spoken in the history of American diplomacy. He told him he had never, in his 50 years of public service, seen a document so crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions. Then he gestured to the door. The result, the political result, was a catastrophe for Japan. Across America that night, on radios in every kitchen from Maine to California, the news repeated itself. Sneak attack, treacherous without warning, without honor. A country, the tree that had been bitterly divided over the war in Europe just hours before. A country where isolationists had held real power in Congress, where America First rallies had drawn enormous crowds, where the question of whether to fight Hitler had been the great unresolved argument of American politics. That country went to bed on the night of December 7th, a different nation than it had been when it woke up. By the morning of December 8th, there were no isolationists left. There was only one America, angry, united, reaching for the rifle in the closet. Pearl Harbor gave Japan time, but it gave America a reason. There is a famous quote attributed to Yamamoto in the days after the attack. You have heard it. Everyone has heard it. He is supposed to have said that all he feared was that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. The truth, the historical truth, is that no one has ever found a source for that quote. It appears in the 1970 film Torah. Torah. It does not appear in any document, any letter, any diary that historians have been able to verify. The screenwriter who put those words in Yamamoto's mouth on the silver screen may have invented them, or he may have captured, in dramatic shorthand, the substance of what Yamamoto really felt, because Yamamoto did speak about Pearl Harbor afterward. And the words he actually used in a verified interview with the Asahi Shimbun newspaper on the 9th of January 1942 were these. A military man, he said, can scarcely take pride in having struck a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply, for the one who was struck. And it is certain that, angered and outraged, the enemy will soon launch a determined counterattack. He had warned Tokyo before the war. He was warning them now, after the first victory. The men around him were celebrating. He was preparing, because the clock had started, and he could already hear it ticking. In the weeks and months that followed Pearl Harbor, the map of the Pacific seemed to dissolve in favor of Japan. It was breathtaking what they did. Even now, 80 years later, the speed of the Japanese expansion remains stunning. On the 10th of December, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, the island of Guam fell. On the 23rd of December, Wake Island fell. On Christmas Day of 1941, the British colony of Hong Kong surrendered. On the 2nd of January 1942, the Japanese army entered Manila in the Philippines. Then came the blow that shocked the world. On the 15th of February 1942, the great British fortress at Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, the symbol of Western power in Asia, the place that was supposed to be impregnable, surrendered to General Yamashita Tomoyuki. Approximately 80,000 British, Australian and Indian troops marched into Japanese captivity. It was the largest surrender of British forces in the history of the British Empire. Winston Churchill would later call it the worst disaster in British military history. And in the wake of that surrender, in the streets of Singapore, came something darker. Over the next several weeks, the Japanese military police, the Kempeitai, conducted what became known as the Sukching Massacre. Tens of thousands of ethnic Chinese civilians, suspected of having supported the British, were rounded up, taken to remote beaches, and shot. Historians estimate the dead at somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000. The truth was deliberately erased. The bodies were buried in mass graves. The families of the missing would search for decades, often in vain, for any trace of what had happened to their fathers and sons. This, too, was the empire Yamamoto served, the same empire whose strategic logic he had questioned, the same empire whose war he had warned against, the same empire whose orders he obeyed. History does not let men separate themselves from the actions of the regimes they serve. And Yamamoto, for all his complexity, for all his foresight, for all his private doubts, was a senior commander of a military that committed atrocities on a scale Japan would spend generations trying to come to terms with. The string of victories continued. The Battle of the Java Sea, on the 27th and 28th of February, crushed the combined American, British, Dutch, and Australian naval forces in the East Indies. On the 9th of March, the Dutch East Indies, with its precious oil fields, the very prize that had set this war in motion, surrendered. On the 8th of May, the American garrison at Corregidor in the Philippines, after a brutal siege, finally laid down its arms. In just 5 months, Japan had conquered an empire larger than Hitler's. From the Aleutian Islands in the north to New Guinea in the south, from the Indian Ocean in the west to the Central Pacific in the east, the rising sun flag now flew over millions of square miles of ocean and land. It looked to the rest of the world like the unstoppable march of a new Asian superpower. It was not. It was something else. Every victory stretched the empire thinner. Every island that fell to Japan now had to be garrisoned. Every airfield had to be supplied. Every port had to be defended. The shipping lanes that connected Tokyo to the new conquests were thousands of miles long, vulnerable, and protected by a merchant marine and an escort fleet that were already, by the spring of 1942, beginning to feel the strain. The elite naval aviators who had trained for years before the war, the men who had bombed Pearl Harbor and devastated Allied forces from Singapore to Ceylon, were now in continuous action. They were tired. Some of them were dead. Their replacements were less skilled, and there were never quite enough of them. The Japanese training pipeline had not been built to feed a long war. Meanwhile, in the United States, the gears were beginning to turn. The Henry J. Kaiser shipyards on the West Coast were retooling for mass production. Detroit, the city Yamamoto had once visited and never forgotten, was converting its automobile assembly lines to build tanks, aircraft, and engines on a scale no nation had ever attempted. Aircraft factories in California, Washington, and Texas were running shifts around the clock. The first Essex-class fleet carriers, the warships that would eventually dwarf the entire Japanese carrier fleet, were being laid down on slipways from Newport News to Bremerton. In Tokyo, the general staff did not see this. They could not see it. They were intoxicated by victory. There is even a Japanese word for what gripped them in those months. Senshobyo. It translates roughly as victory disease. It was the belief that Japan had become unbeatable, that the Americans would never recover, that the war was in effect already won. Yamamoto did not have this disease. He alone, perhaps, looked at the maps with a kind of growing dread. He alone could read what the maps were saying. The Japanese flag now flew over more territory than the Japanese Navy could possibly defend. The supply lines were too long. The bases were too many. The carriers and the pilots and the fuel were stretched thinner with every passing week. He had told them. The time he had warned them about was now. It was April. The clock was running. He did not know how loud it was about to get. On the morning of the 18th of April, 1942, the Japanese home islands were attacked for the first time in over 6 centuries. The man responsible was a 45-year-old American Army pilot named James Harold Doolittle. He was small, tough, balding, a former boxer and air racer with a doctorate in aeronautical engineering. He was also one of the most respected aviators in the United States Army Air Forces. President Franklin Roosevelt had given the Army and Navy a single, urgent demand in the weeks after Pearl Harbor. He wanted to strike back at Japan. He wanted the Japanese people to know that their cities were not safe. He wanted the American people to know that the war was not over. What Doolittle proposed seemed impossible. 16 twin-engine B-25 Mitchell bombers, Army aircraft, not naval, would be loaded onto the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. The Hornet would sail within striking distance of Japan. The bombers would launch from the carrier deck, something no twin-engine bomber had ever done in combat, and fly to Tokyo. They would drop their bombs. And then, because they did not have enough fuel to return to the carrier, they would continue west, fly across the East China Sea, and land at airfields in friendly Chinese territory. It was a one-way mission. The pilots knew it. The air crews knew it. They volunteered anyway. On the morning of the 18th of April, the Hornet was spotted by a Japanese picket boat earlier than planned. Doolittle made the decision to launch immediately, roughly 650 nautical miles from Tokyo, far further than the planned launch point. The B-25s clawed off the rolling, pitching deck one by one, engines screaming, propellers inches from the sea spray. Every single aircraft made it into the air. Hours later, in broad daylight, bombs began to fall on Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. The material damage was modest. A few factories hit, a few hundred casualties on the ground. The psychological damage was catastrophic. For the first time in the lifetime of every Japanese citizen, for the first time since the failed Mongol invasions of the 13th century, enemy aircraft had bombed the home islands. The ocean that had protected Japan for 700 years had failed. In the imperial palace, the emperor was shocked. In the general staff, the generals were enraged. In the combined fleet headquarters, the staff officers looked at each other in disbelief and asked the question that would now haunt them. Where had the American carriers come from? How had they gotten close enough to launch? What was to stop them from doing it again, deeper, harder, against more cities? The bombs did not break Japan's war machine. They broke Japan's illusion of distance. Until the morning of April 18th, Admiral Yamamoto's proposal for the next great Japanese offensive had been politely blocked by the general staff. He had wanted to seize Midway Atoll, a tiny coral outpost in the Central Pacific, and to use the attack as bait to draw the surviving American aircraft carriers into a final, decisive battle. He believed that if he could destroy the remaining American carriers, he could extend the war for another year and perhaps force a negotiated peace. The General Staff had argued instead for an offensive south into the South Pacific to cut the supply lines between America and Australia. After Doolittle, the argument ended overnight. The General Staff approved the Midway operation. The carriers had to be hunted down. The home islands had to be protected. The Americans had to be stopped before they could bomb Tokyo again. The decision was made in a rush, in a hurry, in something that looked a great deal like panic. This was the trap. Not the trap Yamamoto would set for the Americans at Midway. The trap that had been set unintentionally by 16 American medium bombers and a 5'6" Army pilot from Alameda, California. Yamamoto had wanted Midway as a calculated gamble. The Doolittle raid turned it into a desperate one, and desperate plans, as every old sailor knows, are the plans that go wrong. In early May of 1942, off the northeast coast of Australia, came the first warning shot. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought between the 4th and the 8th of May, was the first naval engagement in history, in which the opposing fleets never sighted each other. Carrier aircraft did all the killing. The Japanese were attempting to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea, a step that would have brought them within bombing range of northern Australia. The Americans, alerted by codebreakers in Hawaii, were waiting. The fighting was confused, bloody, and inconclusive. The Americans lost the carrier Lexington, one of those 3 carriers that had been absent from Pearl Harbor. The Yorktown was damaged. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho, but the deeper consequences were hidden in the casualty reports. The Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku was so badly damaged, she had to return to Japan for months of repair. The Japanese fleet carrier Zuikaku was undamaged, but had lost so many of her aircraft and trained air crews that she too was effectively out of action. Both Shokaku and Zuikaku, 2 of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, would now miss the upcoming battle at Midway. And the Americans, while losing the Lexington, brought the wounded Yorktown limping into Pearl Harbor on the 27th of May. The repair experts examined her. They estimated 3 months in dry dock. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the 56-year-old Texan who had taken command of the Pacific Fleet on the last day of 1941, looked at the estimate and shook his head. He gave them 72 hours. Welders and shipfitters worked around the clock. Sparks flew across the dry dock day and night. 3 days later, against every expectation, the Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor under her own power, scarred but operational, and steamed west to join the ambush waiting at Midway. The American industrial machine Yamamoto had warned his country about was beginning to show its teeth. In a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, lit by fluorescent tubes that burned 24 hours a day, a 41-year-old American commander named Joseph Rochefort had been listening to the enemy. He worked when on duty in a smoking jacket and slippers, a habit that infuriated some of his superiors. He smoked constantly. He slept on a cot in the basement when he slept at all. He was an expert in the Japanese language, a brilliant cryptanalyst, and the head of a small, almost forgotten outfit officially called Station Hippo. By April of 1942, Rochefort and his team had broken into JN-25B, the operational code of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They were intercepting roughly 140 Japanese messages a day and decrypting fragments of many of them within hours of transmission. In the spring of 1942, those fragments began to describe something very large, something involving multiple Japanese carriers, something aimed at a location designated in the Japanese code with 2 letters. A and F. Rochefort was certain that AF meant Midway Atoll. Washington was not certain. Admiral Ernest King, the famously cantankerous chief of naval operations, suspected the target might be the Aleutians, or the South Pacific, or perhaps the west coast of the United States itself. Rochefort needed proof. A junior officer on his staff, Commander Jasper Holmes, had an idea. A clever, simple, devious idea. They would have the garrison at Midway transmit a radio message in plain English, unencrypted, stating that the island's freshwater distillation plant had broken down and that the base was running short of drinking water. If AF was Midway, the Japanese would intercept the message, panic, and report up their own chain of command that AF was short of water. The order was sent by underwater cable to Midway on the 19th of May, 1942. Midway broadcast the fake message. 3 days later, on the 22nd of May, Station Hippo intercepted a Japanese signal noting that the AF air unit was reporting a shortage of fresh water. The trap was confirmed. Admiral Nimitz now knew, with mathematical certainty, where the Japanese fleet was going and approximately when it would arrive. The Japanese had no idea that the Americans knew anything at all. Admiral Yamamoto, on the great battleship Yamato, planned his battle. He divided his forces into multiple groups. A diversionary force was sent north to the Aleutian Islands, hoping to draw the Americans away from Midway. Vice Admiral Nagumo's 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would form the strike force. The invasion convoy would carry the troops who would land on the atoll. Yamamoto himself, on the Yamato, would hang back hundreds of miles to the west with the main battle fleet, ready to crush the American carriers when they came rushing in to defend Midway. It was an elegant plan. It assumed surprise. It assumed the Americans would react only after Midway was attacked. It assumed the Japanese fleet would never be ambushed. Every one of these assumptions was wrong. While Yamamoto was dividing his forces, Nimitz was concentrating his. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the miraculously repaired Yorktown, were already steaming northeast of Midway, hiding in a position from which they could ambush the Japanese strike force as it approached the atoll. Yamamoto thought he was setting the trap. Nimitz had already set one for him. The 6-month clock was almost out, and in the gray dawn waiting at the end of the first week of June 1942, the warning Yamamoto had whispered to a Japanese prime minister in a quiet room 2 years earlier was about to come true with a precision that not even he, in his darkest calculations, had ever imagined. The 4th of June, 1942, broke calm and clear over the Central Pacific. At 4:30 in the morning, with the eastern horizon turning the color of pale steel, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo gave the order. From the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 108 Japanese aircraft roared into the sky, climbing toward Midway Atoll. At their head was a 30-year-old lieutenant named Joichi Tomonaga. He had volunteered to lead the strike, despite knowing that one of his fuel tanks had been damaged and could not be repaired. He understood, when he climbed into his cockpit that morning, that he might not be coming back. At 5:20, a long-range American PBY Catalina flying boat broke through the cloud layer and spotted the Japanese fleet. The pilot keyed his radio and sent the message that would change the war. Many planes, heading Midway, 200 miles to the northeast on the bridge of the carrier Enterprise, Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance read the report. The trap was sprung. The hunter was now the hunted. Tomonaga's bombers struck Midway at 6:30. They hit the oil tanks, the seaplane hangars, the powerhouse. But the runway, the heart of the island's combat power, remained intact. As he turned for home, Tomonaga radioed his commander a message that would set in motion the destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy. A second strike is necessary. At 7:10, Nagumo gave the order. The reserve aircraft on his carriers, armed with torpedoes for use against American ships, were to be lowered into the hangars and rearmed with bombs for a second strike on the island. Mechanics swarmed. Torpedoes were detached and rolled into corners. Bombs were wheeled out and bolted on. At 7:28, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone, late to its search pattern, broke radio silence. It had spotted 10 American ships to the northeast. Nagumo froze. Were there carriers among them? He waited. The minutes ticked. At 8:20, confirmation came. One of the American ships appeared to be a carrier. Nagumo gave the order to reverse everything. The bombs that had just been mounted were to be removed. The torpedoes were to be brought back up and remounted. The hangars now became chaos. Ordnance everywhere. Fuel lines snaking across the decks below. Aircraft half-armed, half-ready, scattered between the flight deck and the spaces beneath. At 9:18, the first wave returning from Midway began to land. Tomonaga's surviving aircraft came down one by one on flight decks that should have been clear. The Japanese carriers in that moment were the most dangerous floating bombs in the history of naval warfare, and the Americans were 60 miles away and closing. They came in 3 waves of torpedo bombers. From the Hornet came Torpedo Squadron 8, led by a 41-year-old lieutenant commander named John Waldron. He had Sioux ancestry through his mother, raised on the South Dakota plains, a fierce and devoted leader who had told his men the night before that if only one plane was left in the squadron at the end, he wanted that pilot to drive home and get a hit. They flew without fighter escort. Their slow, ungainly TBD Devastator torpedo planes had no chance against the Japanese Zero fighters. The Zeros tore them apart in the air. Every one of Waldron's 15 aircraft was shot down. 29 of the 30 men aboard them died, most never even getting close enough to drop a torpedo. Only one pilot, a young ensign named George Gay, survived. He floated for hours in the wreckage of the battle, hiding beneath a seat cushion, watching everything that came next from the water. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise came next. 10 of 14 aircraft were destroyed. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. Of 12 aircraft, 10 were lost. Not one American torpedo found a target. Waldron and his men, and the men of 6 and the men of 3, died for nothing, the official histories would later say. But this is not true. They died because the Japanese fighters, the deadly Zeros that protected the carriers, had to come down to sea level to slaughter them. And down there, low over the water, the Zeros could not see what was coming from above. At 10:20 in the morning, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers arrived simultaneously over the Japanese fleet from 20,000 feet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's group from the Enterprise had nearly given up the search. Running low on fuel, McCluskey had made one last intuitive decision, following the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northeast at flank speed. The destroyer led him straight to the Japanese carriers. At almost exactly the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from the Yorktown appeared from another direction. The Zeros were still at sea level, finishing off the torpedo planes. The skies above the Japanese carriers were empty. For 6 minutes between 22 and 10:28 in the morning of June 4th, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers fell from the sky like stones. American pilots later said it looked like the carriers had been waiting for them. Akagi was hit, then Kaga, then Soryu. In the hangars below, in the chaos of half-chained ordnance and exposed fuel lines, the bombs detonated. Torpedoes exploded, aviation gasoline ignited. Aircraft armed and loaded began to cook off in chain reactions that no damage control crew could stop. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers, 3 of the 6 ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months before, were burning beyond saving. Only Hiryu remained. That afternoon, in a final act of defiance, Hiryu launched 2 attacks against the Yorktown. The American carrier was hit, set ablaze, and would later be sunk by a Japanese submarine. But by sunset, American dive bombers had found Hiryu too. By dawn on the 5th of June, all 4 Japanese carriers lay at the bottom of the Pacific. There is a story, repeated in countless books, that the Japanese carriers were caught with their flight decks packed full of armed and fueled aircraft ready to launch. The story says the Americans arrived just 5 minutes too late, or 5 minutes too early, depending on whose side you were on. This story is not true. It was invented after the war by the same Mitsuo Fuchida who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor in a book published in 1955. He wrote what he wished had happened. He wrote a version that gave the defeated Japanese Navy a way to save face. 5 minutes, he wrote. 5 minutes from a great counterstrike. 5 minutes from victory. The truth, as later historians established from Japanese records, was worse. The Japanese flight decks were not packed and ready. The aircraft were in the hangars below, in a state of confused rearmament, surrounded by fuel and explosives that should never have been there in such quantities at such a moment. There was no 5-minute miss. There was an unfolding catastrophe that had been building since Nagumo gave the order to switch his bomb loads, and the Americans simply arrived inside the window that catastrophe had created. By nightfall on June 5th, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, the heavy cruiser Mikuma, 3,057 men. Among them were 110 of her irreplaceable carrier aviators, and several hundred of the elite mechanics and flight deck technicians who could not be trained in time to fight again. The Americans had lost the Yorktown, the destroyer Hammond, and 307 men. It was, by any measure, one of the most decisive naval battles in human history. It was also exactly 6 months, almost to the day, after the morning the first Japanese bombs had fallen on Pearl Harbor. Far to the west, on the bridge of the great battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the reports of his disaster in silence. He did not shout. He did not weep. He stood at the windows of his flag bridge and looked out at the gray Pacific, and according to the officers who were with him, he did not speak for a long time. He had warned them. He had said 6 months, maybe a year. He had not, in any precise sense, predicted Midway. He had not foreseen the codebreakers in the basement at Pearl Harbor. He had not foreseen the Yorktown sailing in 3 days after being given 3 months. He had not foreseen Wade McCluskey following a destroyer wake. At the moment, he was about to turn back for fuel. He had simply known the larger truth, that America would wake up, that America would rage, that America would build, that the window in which Japan could possibly dominate the Pacific would close, and that when it closed, it would not open again. And now, on this June afternoon in 1942, the window had closed. His warning had not failed because he had misunderstood America. His warning had failed because Japan had ignored what he had understood. 11 months later, on the 18th April, 1943, 1 year to the day, after Doolittle's bombers had broken Japan's illusion of distance, Admiral Yamamoto boarded a transport plane at the Japanese base at Rabaul. He was flying south on a tour of forward positions in the Solomon Islands, to inspect units, to lift morale, to be seen by his men. His itinerary had been transmitted by radio. In a basement at Pearl Harbor, the codebreakers of Station Hypo intercepted it. They decrypted it. They sent it up the chain to Admiral Nimitz. 16 long-range P-38 8-miters lifted off from Henderson Field at Guadalcanal. That morning, their pilots briefed for the longest fighter intercept mission of the war. They flew low over the ocean, navigating by dead reckoning, climbing only at the last moment. Over the jungle south of Bougainville, they found the transport exactly on schedule, exactly where the decrypted signal had said it would be. A young Army pilot named Rex Barber fired a long burst into the lumbering Mitsubishi G4M bomber. The plane shuddered, dropped a wing, and disappeared into the canopy of the rainforest below. The exact credit for the kill would be disputed for the rest of Barber's life, but the man inside that plane was already gone. The man who had warned Japan about American industry, American intelligence, American long-range aviation, and American resolve had been killed by all 4 of them at once. The system he had begged his country to fear had crossed the Pacific sky and found him. Japan did not lose the war because Admiral Yamamoto failed to understand America. Japan lost the war because he understood it perfectly, and Japan went to war anyway, 6 months, maybe a year. He had told the Prime Minister. He had told the cabinet. He had told the men who would not listen. And then, when they ignored him, he obeyed. He planned the attack he had spent 10 years arguing against. He launched the gamble he had spent his whole career warning could not be won. He bought his country its 6 months, and then, exactly as he had said it would, the time ran out. The high transport plane carved its slow arc above the jungle canopy. The fighters climbed to meet it. The clock that had started over Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December finished its long count over Bougainville on the 18th of April. A Japanese admiral, 59 years old in white gloves and a pressed uniform, looked out his window one last time at the sky he had crossed so many times. He had seen this coming. He had simply been the only man in Tokyo who had.